The Italian Navy had been a bit slow off the mark when it came to dreadnoughts, missing the first generation entirely, but doing a pretty decent job on entering the race with a second generation dreadnought, the Dante Alighieri. But with the Austro-Hungarians on one side and the French on the other, both looking at building whole classes of dreadnought, one battleship was never going to be enough. At the time, the Italians were notionally allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, so the ostensible threat was the French Courbet class. Whilst this didn't mean the Italians would have to stretch too far to do much better, they decided to give it a go anyway and began a new design instead of simply repeating the earlier Dante. This was now the era of the first generation super dreadnoughts, but getting their hands on a bigger gun at short notice was judged to be a step too far, and so the 12-inch gun would be retained. They'd simply add another gun to the main battery, which resulted in a ship that was only one gun behind the soon-to-be HMS Agincourt. This yielded a ship armed with 13 such weapons in 5 turrets, an odd combination of 3 triple and 2 twins, with the twins superfiring over the triples fore and aft and a single triple turret amidships. No less than 18 single casement-mounted 4.7-inch or 120mm guns were installed as a secondary battery, and in a move unusual in dreadnoughts generally, but in keeping with Italian style specifically, 14 portable single 3-inch guns were also included, these being able to be positioned in a wide variety of pre-prepared points on the ship, plus 3 submerged torpedo tubes, 1 on each side and 1 astern. Something in the region of 32,000 shaft horsepower drove 4 screws, giving the ships a top speed of just under 22 knots. Slightly underperforming on the desired just over 22 knots, but not by an awful lot. A main armour belt just under 10 inches thick, slightly better protected gun turrets and a relatively thin deck gave mediocre protection for the time period, although a substantial amount of the main belt was underwater. The ship was, however, still extensively armoured against smaller shells due to the distributed armour scheme and an awful lot of thinner armour plate. Production delays meant that although all 3 ships would be laid down in 1910, Giulio Cesare and Leonardo da Vinci would not enter service until May 1914, and Conte di Cavour would not see service until almost a year after that, in April 1915. Weirdly, for the ship that gave its name to the class, Cavour was the last to be laid down, the first to be launched, but the last to be commissioned. The ships would see a rather placid World War I, with the exception of Leonardo da Vinci, which contrived to blow up its main magazines in 1916 during ammunition loading procedures. Despite rolling over and sinking, she would be salvaged and brought into dock by some Herculean efforts, with the intention of refitting and modernising her later on. Post-war, the ships would see numerous changes, reducing the tertiary battery, increasing anti-aircraft armament, installing aircraft themselves, and both replacing and moving the foremast. Post-war budget cuts saw the hulk of the Da Vinci go to the scrapyards, but in the mid-1930s the 2 remaining ships underwent one of the most extensive and radical modernisation programs any battleship would ever see. New boilers, providing more than double the original power output, were installed, now running through only 2 screws, but sending the ships up to just over 27 knots. The amidships triple turret was removed entirely, along with the torpedo tubes and every single gun otherwise found aboard. The remaining 4 turrets would have their guns bored out to 12.6 inches, and a new secondary battery of 120mm anti-surface and 100mm anti-aircraft guns was fitted, along with some machine guns that would eventually be replaced by 20mm and 37mm cannon. Deck armour was significantly increased, the superstructure, fire control system and torpedo defence system were all replaced, and a new bow was simply built over the existing one to improve speed and seakeeping. This pushed the ships up by about 3,000 tons in terms of standard displacement to just over 26,000 tons, and made them fairly credible warships in World War II, which is not a bad feat when their British counterparts were all long scrapped and the American equivalent, Arkansas, had been consigned to second-line duties. Both ships would see action in World War II, Giulio Cesare matching up against Warspite at the Battle of Calabria and ending up on the receiving end of one of the longest-range hits in battleship history, which forced a number of boilers offline and in turn forced the ship to disengage. For Cavour, that would be about it for the war, as she was hit by the fleet air arm attack on Taranto and partially sunk. She'd still be under repair when the Italian involvement in the war on the Axis side ended, and plans to refit her fell through with further damage from an air attack. She'd end up being scrapped in 1946. Giulio Cesare wasn't done yet, though, taking part in 2 further major engagements before ceding her frontline role to the Littorios. Unfortunately for her, she was later handed over to the USSR as a war prize, where, as the Novorossiysk, she was reworked and refitted a number of times until she encountered an old German mine in 1956, capsizing and taking more than 600 men with her, the wreck being salvaged and scrapped the following year.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.